Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This week we are discussing Chapter 8, the final chapter of Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth. The title of the chapter is Building an Economy for the People. And this is the chapter where she really gets into the nitty-gritty of the job guarantee, which is one of the central policy prescriptions for MMT. So I'm going to start by getting right into the quotes. Here we'll go to the first one. Finally, Mosler recognized the profound strain the Great Recession had on state and local government budgets. To help these currency-using governments weather the sharp decline in tax revenues, he proposed $500 billion in aid distributed on a per capita basis to all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and US island territories. That would have protected tens of thousands of teachers, firefighters, police, and other public sector workers whose jobs were on the line as state revenues dried up. So that's an interesting, so another way to fund state governments, of course, is to distribute basic income to everyone on an individual basis, and then they can pay their state taxes using that. So that, that's kind of a more, I don't know, it's more compatible with the incentives of you're a state or local government and you want to provide services that attract people who pay the taxes that pay for the services, right? So certainly there's an incentive to implement your public spending more efficiently if you are collecting taxes from the people instead of just getting funded directly from the top down. But you could do it that way. And it's interesting that she's talking about protecting teachers and firefighters, et cetera, instead of talking about protecting education and protecting, our fire safety and other infrastructure and stuff like that. She's emphasizing the workers themselves as people rather than the services that they provide. So in here, when we're thinking about people and we're thinking about basic income, we're thinking about, okay, well, how do we benefit people in the capacity as people so they can get the most out of the economy? And that's not tied really to what they're putting into the economy. So we have these services that are important that we need people to be contributing to, but it's okay if we can provide those services and have fewer workers or pay the workers less and that kind of thing, because we don't necessarily need to force people to get their livelihoods through what they're doing in their job. So that's why I picked that quote.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in, Alex. I know at other times you've talked about funding the states directly as an efficient way to do things. So I understand what you're saying about it kind of incentivizing states to attract taxpayers, but I also think that there are some downsides to that way of doing things as well. Like, first of all, as you often pointed out, taxes have various effects on the economy depending on how you do them, and the amount of taxes that you want to collect might not really line up with the optimal amount of spending. There also could be reasons that we would want to fund less populated places still well, because maybe it's not so efficient per capita to have a bustling fire department in a rural area, but we still want to have so there are certain services that we want to cover everybody effectively. So you might need to just do top-down funding for that and have it cost a little more in some places than others per person, that kind of thing. So yeah, I guess a mix might make sense, but I'm not totally sold on just doing it through taxes.
Yeah, you certainly need top-down funding for some things. And of course, basic income itself is, we pay for that through top-down funding. So it's a hybrid of top-down and bottom-up, right? Because it's a top-down way of providing people access to the economy from the bottom up.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting, it's almost a spin on what you often mention about, or I often talk about too, sort of what things does the market take care of and what things does the government take care of the best. And this idea of attracting citizens to pay taxes is kind of like treating moving around geographically as a market, treating that as a consumer looking for a state. So I guess you could ask the same question with state funding, what's handled best by like the market of people moving around and what's handled best by like just funding the state governments directly. And I think that it's complicated.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because funding the governments directly from the top down, even if regardless of where they get their funding from, when they spend, that's still going to be from the top down as well at the level of the state.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true.
So a question you can ask is, are there going to be situations where I think you're right that it has to do with, well, what if the amount of money that a government needs doesn't directly correspond to the number of people that are living there? I think you highlighted the key concern there.
And like incentive effects of like taxes as well. But yeah, the analogy was from the federal government's perspective. What's handled best by the federal government doing top-down funding to the states, and what's handled best by them funding the citizens and like letting the citizens choose the state or the city that they need.
And when you talk about the incentive effects of the tax, you have to keep in mind that the absence of basic income, like having a lower basic income, is a form of a tax as well. So the question is whether you want to tax the people in these states directly by reducing the basic income and then handing the money back to the states, or do you want to give everyone a basic income and then allow the states to design their taxes how they want them for whatever purposes they want.
Yeah, that's important. I guess one last note, and we've talked about this in here before, is like people can be kind of sticky in terms of moving around. And like, it's not even that it's optimal necessarily for people to be constantly moving around, because the formation of communities and like families and extended families staying together, all these things have like big quality of life benefits. So that's a factor to consider in setting up your system. Like, do you really want to try to push people towards maximum mobility, or do you want to kind of make the existing places good to live? There are pros and cons there, but
yeah, and we can ask, some of the stickiness is coming from kind of economic inefficiency too. Like, people are tied to jobs. There's less, like, it's expensive to move to a new place, to do all your kind of the things you need to do when you move, to buy a new house, and like there's a lot of hurdles there. And I think all else being equal, we want to make it easier for people to kind of transition in whatever way they want to transition in terms of location, that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean that it's going to eliminate all of the stickiness. There are going to be reasons why people want to stay in a place.
Right. Like, I agree that it's efficient in other ways for people to be mobile. So it's nice to remove barriers. But I also think there are big quality of life impacts that aren't about economics. Specifically, like people wanting to live near their friends and family from when they grew up, and extended families wanting to stay together, and just like forming communities and even emotional attachments to geography and so on. And those things, I think those things can be kind of brushed aside too easily by thinking about the benefits of kind of moving around.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what maybe makes it a little bit reasonable to brush aside these concerns in some contexts is that when you're talking about people moving, you're talking about the people on the margins, right? You're not talking about the people for whom it's the stickiest. So it's okay to say, oh, it's okay for people to have more of an incentive to move. And that takes pressure off the people who remain sometimes as well.
I mean, I think sometimes it's not just on the margins. Like, if there are basically entire areas of the country where like pretty much, well, because of climate change or because of economic conditions right now, without a basic income, like pretty much everybody would need to move. Like, the whole community would kind of need to disperse. Like, there are situations like that where it's not just people at the margins. It's kind of like a question of more fundamental.
And community shift. Now that you bring it up, it's also the case that if you have a very low population density area and you're funding it on a kind of like per capita basis with like a basic income or something like that, then you're not going to have the the returns to scale that you get from kind of pooling everyone's money in a bigger community, that kind of thing. So that might create even more incentive to move. So the question is, is that okay? Do we want to say like, oh, if you're gonna like live somewhere really inefficiently, then we don't want to subsidize that or something like that. Anyway, there's lots of things that can go in here. The only point that I wanted to point out is that you could do some kind of funding mechanism of states through the states having taxes and just increasing the amount of basic income you give to everyone. And Austin and Eddie have some interesting comments in the chat. Austin says, in Australia, the Reserve Bank has been buying bonds issued by the states in the secondary market, and that backs up the debt or the infrastructure projects. So since COVID, they've been doing that. I think there's something similar in the United States. So if the Federal Reserve is, we're used to them buying the debt of the federal government, but if they're buying the debt of states and municipalities, then that creates more room for those states and municipalities to spend more, especially if the central bank commits to keeping that debt on its balance sheet and not letting it back into the market, that kind of thing, and rolling it over. Yeah. So let's go to the next quote here. This is a short one. Mosler explained that the purpose of collecting taxes is to regulate inflation. So this is an interesting point that often comes up with MMT. They imagine that there's a certain amount of money just kind of churning in the economy, and then the taxes kind of siphon some of that off to prevent it from getting to be too much. And really they're focused on the flows of money that the taxes generate rather than any of the incentives or any of the prices that get affected or anything like that. Like if you have a 10% tax on meat, then the price of meat is 10% higher. From an MMT often will just emphasize the flow of revenue that's generated, or the flow of cash that's generated by the tax, or the flow. I guess they don't care about the revenue for the government, but they care about the money being pulled out of the private sector economy. And I should also say that if you talk to an MMT person, they'll tell you that taxes are just one of the ways you can regulate inflation. There's lots of things you can adjust to, ensure price stability, and taxes are one of the tools. But if you ask them what taxes are for, they will say that taxes are for this purpose.
Doesn't she also mention dealing with wealth inequality as another purpose for taxes at some point in the book?
Yes, that's true. And it's also true that MMTers will say that taxes drive the currency.
Right, I was thinking that too, yeah.
Yeah, and so the idea is that, the currency is worth something because you have to pay taxes. So you're going to get it. That creates demand for the currency. So you're going to go get some money and turn around and pay the government, because if you don't, you're in trouble, that kind of thing.
She throws that into this chapter, like kind of random. Every time she throws it in, I'm like, this is so superfluous and doesn't make any sense. She throws it in like, see, people have an incentive to want to work because of this whole tax thing. And I'm like, what about the fact that they need money? Like, this is so unnecessary. Anyway, I don't know if you pulled that quote, but she threw it in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the MMT story is that people need money because the government is taxing them, and
that's clearly false.
I agree.
I mean, it's empirically false. Like, people with no money don't have to pay any taxes in our economy.
Well, I mean, you could say that the absence of basic income is a tax, right? If you really want it to be,
I don't think that's what they have in mind.
That's not what they have in mind. But you could say that, like, there's a level of basic income where nobody wants to work, and then you keep lowering that, and that's a head tax, and that creates
I like that perspective, but it's a different point, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, I don't want to keep bringing us far afield. I'm sure you have important quotes too.
No, that's okay. Let me see if I can find the next one here. Yeah. Okay. So let's share this quote. MMT is not a religion, and it's not looking for disciples to follow some screed. I think she means creed. What it offers is a realistic description of how a modern fiat currency works, along with some prescriptive ideas about how to transform that understanding into better policy. So there's a few things here. One is that MMT is very interesting in terms of, it does have this kind of like these online followers who are very much like rah rah MMT. It's kind of become this kind of political movement. So maybe not so much a religion per se, but it feels like a movement with disciples who are following a creed. Now, I think maybe underlying that, some of the more serious MMT economists maybe don't feel that way. So that's, someone could, maybe there could be a movement of people, following my stuff, and I wouldn't want the underlying, intellectual side of it to be necessarily characterized as that. So I can understand why she's saying that here. What it offers is a realistic description of how a modern fiat currency works. So I think, every economic theory is trying to offer something that is useful, especially like any kind of macroeconomic, anything that informs policy. You're trying to really understand what's going on. So I don't think MMT is unique in that respect, and I don't think they're unique in the respect of the fact that they think they're right and other people are wrong. So I think that's not really anything that differentiates MMT, is the idea that the believers and the followers of it believe that it provides a realistic description. Perhaps that it's focusing on currency and how money works. A lot of economists, even macroeconomists, abstract away from that. And then the prescriptive ideas about how to transform that understanding into better policy. So if the understanding is right, then yeah, that can be helpful. If the understanding is flawed in some ways, then you're not going to get the right policies out the other end, right? Garbage in, garbage out. So that can be a challenge.
I feel like I have a couple of thoughts on this as well.
Yeah.
So one thing is, like, it's interesting because I noticed that in this final chapter, she has so many metaphors. A lot of them are really good metaphors, but there are kind of just like so many of them. And why I'm bringing that up is like, why is there this kind of following for MMT, right? Like, that's so emphatic. And I think part of it is like the message is very inspiring and different, which is that like we're kind of leaving a lot on the table that we don't have to. There's a lot more that we can accomplish, all of that. And she also in the book kind of like, I think, fuels it a bit by framing it as this whole like she literally calls it like a Copernican paradigm shift, so it's like she's really amping it up, like emotion, as a huge different perspective, like a huge insight basically that changes a lot, that is consequential. And so I think the book really amps that up, and then like uses all these metaphors and so on to try to amp that up as well. So I think that can help get a following, even if that's not exactly what you're trying to do. The second point I have about the prescriptions is as we've commented on before in here, the prescriptions that she has don't like they relate to MMT, but they don't necessarily follow as the only possible prescription. So in particular, I think most people reading this book would potentially think that a basic income is quite compatible with MMT as well. Like, if you read really carefully, you'll see that she has a few assumptions kind of implied that lean her towards a job guarantee as opposed to a basic income. But the main thrust of the point of this book is that government spending is constrained by resources and not just by dollars, and that we're underspending. And so from that, you could pull all sorts of different policies. And she kind of makes this point as well. She's like, well, you could just fund a lot of wars with this, perspective as well. Or you could whatever, you could fund all sorts of different kinds of things, or you could just cut taxes a lot. It just shows that the spending could be higher, right? And the taxes don't have to be as high. So from that perspective, I think many people would say, oh, so like an alternative to a jobs guarantee would be a basic income. And like both of these kind of become more possible when you take an MMT point of view. That's what I think, like not an MMTer, but like a lay person reading this book, I think might think that. I think I would think that if I read this book. And so it's interesting that the MMT camp as a community seems to be very much against a basic income and for a jobs guarantee, because I think that's mostly a separate point from kind of the key insights that they're trying to offer intellectually. There might be some side insights they're trying to offer that relate to the jobs guarantee, but it seems like the key controversial insights really don't lead you there versus a basic income per se. They're really just about the amount of spending. And so like, I do think it's interesting that debate has ended up being where it is, where like MMTers are like staunchly against basic income, despite the fact that their perspective you might think would lead them to be more sympathetic to it than the average person. So I'm sure we're going to get into the jobs guarantee, but the prescriptions part sort of made me think about that.
Yeah, she doesn't mention basic income in this book at all. She has talked about it at other times. And MMT, I think you're right that most of what she says in this book is compatible with basic income. But MMT, and maybe she's being careful to write it that way so as not to offend too many people. But I think MMT is generally speaking not compatible with basic income. And it has to do with this taxes drive the currency thing. And Austin says in the chat, driving the currency and preventing inflation are fairly similar. And I would say that from my perspective, yes, that's true. Price stability is a necessary condition for something to be adopted as the economy's currency, as money, right? And you can use taxes as one of your tools to help keep the price level stable, to help keep the purchasing power of your currency stable. But interestingly enough, MMT has kind of separates the idea of price stability of 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 the stable value of currency from where does the currency get its value from how widely is it accepted. And what they emphasize with taxes is that it makes it so that the currency is accepted. You need taxes in order, or you need currency in order to pay the taxes, right? The money is a tax credit. And they're really not talking about price stability at that point. They're not talking about inflation. They're thinking of that as a separate thing that needs to be managed because of the economy's real resources, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not part of their story about taxes drive the currency.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next quote. By helping us to see more clearly what the obstacles are, e.g. inflation, and aren't, e.g. running out of money, MMT opens the door to a new way of thinking about how we could run our economy. So I would just point out here that the problem with this is that running out of money and inflation are the same thing. From the perspective of the government. The economy is ultimately constrained by real resources. We all agree on that. And the government can't buy what isn't for sale. They're out of money when they're out of things to buy. And if they want to pretend that they're not out of money, that's when we get inflation. So it's very much, you can map this on to people's normal intuitions or people's kind of the common thinking about governments running out of money, but she's very reluctant to do that and likes to kind of separate the government can't run out of money and you need to worry about inflation as kind of separate things.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think that she sort of following up on my point before, she does a really nice job making this case about the separability of them and about the importance of focusing on real resource constraints. And well, she kind of says that and inflation interchangeably, which I know you don't agree with, but she kind of makes a nice point about the separation, and she's very compelling. So like I'm really with her for a lot of the book, and then there are these pieces of things that like I strongly disagree with, but I do want to emphasize that I think she's very persuasive and I think she makes really good points, and I can see also therefore why she has like a decent, or not just her, but I think she's helped to popularize MMT, why MMT has like such a big following.
Yeah. So Austin says he doesn't see how the stuff about tax connects with the hostility to basic income. So I think one obvious way to connect that up is that basic income is the opposite of a tax, right? It's a negative tax. So you're doing the opposite of driving a currency when you are implementing a basic income. Now, in terms of, when they think about a tax, they think about the government levies a tax and that creates unemployment. And then the reason why you do that is to get people to do work for the government. And then you pay them in tax credits so they can pay the tax. That's kind of like the standard MMT line. Basic income doesn't really fit into that story of the government provisioning labor for itself, because you're giving people money that is not in exchange for something, and you're not getting resources in exchange for the spending. So it feels like spending on nothing. It feels like the government is spending on nothing, and therefore it's got to be inflationary because you're not you're not activating resources when you spend. Of course, there are resources that are getting activated because when the consumers spend money, that activates resources as well. But the MMT line is that, you know, you can't just hand people money because it's unproductive spending. Whereas if you employ people, now they're producing something. So not only are you increasing people's spending, but you're also increasing the economy's output. So it kind of balances out.
Wait, I'm super confused about that. It doesn't make sense to me at all. Because let me walk you why I'm confused.
Yeah.
So like if you give money to a teacher, I don't know, if you do government spending on like public works or whatever, which is what they want to do, the money is going towards the roads, I guess, and then it goes towards like whatever they spend it on, their salaries or whatnot. Yeah, but let's take, I wanted to take salaries out of this. So let's say you just like you government spend on a plane, right? Because she says you can do military spending, like you government spend on a plane, versus you give people money and they buy some stuff with it. Like I don't see how those are really different, right? In terms of like the inflationary effects. It seems like she's willing to say that you can just buy stuff that the government wants to buy. And so why does it matter if it's the government buying that stuff or the people?
Yes, I would say that it doesn't, but these are the kind, I mean, like, I wish she had talked more about basic income in this particular book. So I have to kind of like pull in kind of what I hear from MMT people in other places. But yeah, I mean, like, I think some MMT people will acknowledge that, yeah, you can give people some amount of money directly, unconditionally, and maybe that'll be fine. But why do that when you could give them money and activate more resources for the benefit of society at the same time? It seems like one of these is strictly worse than the other.
Yes, right? I think that's the impression I get. Is like it's that she clearly notes several times that she feels she clearly implies several times and maybe explicitly states that like labor is a limiting resource. Like labor is key to our productive capacity and it's a limiting resource. So like so you can get a lot more productivity and you can actually afford to spend a lot more overall if you're activating as much labor as possible. She also in this chapter clearly indicates that she thinks the opportunity cost of people's time is essentially zero, which is something that I found very insulting. But she's like, she literally says like idleness, like you're just like, you know, letting people languish in idleness who would be willing to donate all of those hours to productive activities. Like they're doing nothing of value. Like really it implies they're doing nothing of value whatsoever. But if that's it without being paid for a job. So if that's what you believe, then of course, like it makes sense. And on top of that, she believes there are like these negative well-being effects to not having a job, that it's like depressed, you know, because she's looking at we've talked about why this would look to be the case in the data, but she's basically assuming that like, not only this, like the person is happier, like doing the job and they're being more productive and they're basically wasting their time sitting around being depressed and like doing nothing otherwise, right? So that's kind of like her view. And I suspect that if you have that view, of course you want to give people a job, but this view is, I think, like deeply, deeply flawed. And just like an obvious problem with it that I'm sure she would have some answer for is like, there's no understanding in this framework of a jobs guarantee of how anybody gets to be with their own kids, like outside of like 40 hours a week working, I guess. Like you're not allowed, like there's no way to watch your own kids. Presumably both parents have to work. The minimum wage is only $15 an hour, which is not that they want to set for the job guarantee. So like you probably have to have two incomes. And then probably they try to offer like childcare or something, but it's like not giving, anyways, that's like a really basic one that I think like we've just so paradigm shifted as a culture where we used to think that one parent should stay home, which I also think was a problem because it was like implied that you had to do that and had to be the woman and so on. But now it's like, oh no, like nobody gets to be with their kids. So I don't really think that just seems like a big like glaring problem that I think almost anybody could see. The other issues are like more subtle, but I do find it I do find it problematic. Similar with care, like she talks about how we have an aging society and stuff, but like you presumably can hire someone with a jobs guarantee to care for your relative, but like can't care for your relative yourself. Should you want to do that? It's like a weird thing when you have this system. So that's only one of my many issues with the jobs guarantee. But I thought I just wanted to say that like this appears to be the worldview that like you're idle and doing nothing productive for yourself or other people. You're depressed, like if you don't have a job. And so like, and we really need the labor. Like labor is a constraining resource on productivity. So if you put that together, of course, like you want to have a jobs guarantee, which I don't agree with any of those assumptions, but.
Yeah, these people are suffering and you have an easy way to help them feel better. to make their lives better. So why not do it, right? It feels like this obvious thing if you're kind of in the MMT perspective. Yeah.
And just to, maybe I'll just say one more thing since I brought all of that up, and then I'll leave it. Like the reason that you would see this in the data about like being depressed when you don't have a job and like suicide when you don't have a job and so on is because like jobs are your source of income and social prestige in our current culture. So like obviously you don't like do well when you don't have a job, but that doesn't mean that in a world with basic income, even before the prestige adjusted, I'm sure you'd see a big drop in the mental health effects of not having a job. And then once like the culture changed, you would see even bigger shifts. So anyway, I think that this is like a pretty superficial way of looking at the data.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, people's psychology is adapted to the conditions in which they're living and the incentives that they're being subjected to. We had a good discussion with you and Erez on here at the end of last year, where we kind of broke down that kind of the idea that there's like this inherent psychology of people need jobs, otherwise that kind of thing.
Yeah. But also right now your income is tied to it as well. Like that's also just not even an internalized cultural thing. Like you just won't have as much income if you don't have a job. Like you might have half of your income from unemployment insurance, but that's still only half.
Well, there have been studies where you give people the income without the job and they're less happy than the income with the job and stuff like that. So they do a little bit more of that, but it's still ultimately, you're right, that it's still the same explanation that, you know, like we live in a society where we're forcing people to need this thing, and we don't have to be living in that society.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right, I'll let you go to your next.
So let's go to the next one. If there are millions of people looking for paid work and our economy has the capacity to produce more goods and services without raising prices, then we have the fiscal space to bring those resources into productive employment. That's a typo on my part with the raising. Sure. I think something that's important to distinguish here is the difference between input capacity, which is how much are we using up of our potential of our resources? How much of our resources are we using up? Versus the output capacity, which is how much are we producing of our total potential to produce? And the second one, obviously, you want to get the most out of the economy, without, causing any damage or bad externalities or anything like that. You generally, you want to get the most out. You want to maximize the output, the benefit that people get from the economy. You don't necessarily want to max out your input capacity. You don't necessarily want to be like, oh, we have extra resources lying around. We got to find a way to use them. There's a fire pit over there. Let's throw them in the fire pit, right? And that's the same thing, like people are a resource. People's time is a resource. So you don't just want to arbitrarily employ people. And this is what you were getting at before, Bethany, that there's an opportunity cost of pulling people away from how they would otherwise be spending their time. So we need to be very, like we're never going to be perfect about it, but we at least need to have in our minds this idea that there's a trade-off when we employ people.
Yeah. And I think this is one of the many examples throughout the book where it's just clear, and she's not always even elaborating on it, but she's just clearly pointing out that she views labor as an important constraining resource on productive capacity. Like she just kind of throws it in like this as assumed. And that's one example where she does that.
Yeah, it's kind of a more mainstream economic view. I feel like this is something that mainstream economics gets wrong, and it's something that MMT kind of latched onto and doubled down on, unfortunately. And that's kind of what they're all about, is like, oh, it's very easy to bring the economy to full employment, but that's really not what you want with economic policy. So let's go to the next one. MMT urges us to demote monetary policy, at least in its current form, and elevate fiscal policy as the primary tool for macroeconomic stabilization. That's another typo on my part. So it's interesting because it depends on what we're talking about stabilizing, right? So monetary policy is pretty much automatic. Fiscal policy, she talks in this chapter about, wanting to put fiscal policy into the driver's seat and have fiscal policy being doing more of the stuff. But fiscal policy is already in the driver's seat, and monetary policy is generally pretty reactive. Like they have to do whatever they need to do to ensure there's a stable price level. Now, a little bit of kind of behind the scenes on MMT is that by demote monetary policy, what they want the central bank to do is to fix interest rates at zero. They think of the natural rate of interest as being zero. And then they want everything to be managed on the fiscal side and through regulation. Whereas in the actual world that we live in, monetary policy, it adjusts based on what the fiscal authority is doing. So the fiscal authority is in the driver's seat. The fiscal authority is the dog, and the monetary policy is the tail. But the tail is doing things automatically to compensate for what fiscal policy is doing to ensure a stable price level and other forms of stability. So that's just kind of like a little bit of background on what MMT is talking about when they want to demote monetary policy.
That makes sense. It seems like she undervalues or underestimates the value of like the interest rates as a way to affect kind of private lending and credit bubbles. We've talked about this before, but that just seems to be absent from this book.
Right. Kind of like with the taxes, they focus on the flow of money out of the private sector as a way of kind of like siphoning off money to prevent inflation, that kind of thing. With interest rates, they are not focusing on interest rates as a price. They're focusing on interest payments as a flow of money, again, between the private sector and the public sector. So that gives you a very different view of what interest rates do and what the effects are. And if they're like, well, what's the point of these flows? We don't need flows. We can just set the interest rate to zero. But that's not what interest rates are about. It's about adjusting the price of borrowing and adjusting credit conditions and how much money is being created within the private financial sector. So yeah, and Eddie says, he thinks MMTers think a 0% interest rate would hold back wealthy capitalists by not paying them interest, but it's also 180 degrees the opposite. 0% interest rate just drives asset prices to the sky, benefiting wealthy capitalists more than anyone else. That's exactly right. The lower the interest rates, the higher the asset prices. And MMT would come back, would say, oh, well, we need to regulate the financial sector to prevent that from happening. But really, there is a very clear and straightforward price mechanism here that you can use to rein in the financial sector. And MMT, I think, is making it harder on themselves by kind of foregoing that and saying like, oh, we just need to clamp down on everything with regulation and all of that. So let's go to the next one here. Or do you have anything else you wanted to?
No, we got it.
Okay. So let's see. And Austin says, and you keep inefficient zombie companies alive. That's right. Money is cheaper. You can just keep rolling over your debt when interest rates are low. So here, unemployment is defined as people seeking paid work in the government's unit of account. The US dollar is basically a tax credit. MMT is the only macroeconomic approach that understands this, and the job guarantee follows directly from this understanding. So unemployment is defined as people seeking paid work in the government's unit of account. So it's interesting that she specifies in the government's unit of account, because, like if someone pays you, you can always turn that into money later. There's, markets for that. But people seeking paid work. So this gets into this kind of like thorny area of like, well, what counts as seeking paid work? Everyone wants more money, right? Everyone, like if someone has a job and they get offered another job that pays a lot more, then okay, that's great. Or they're spending their time and they're not being paid. If that time is going to suddenly be paid, then yeah, that's great. I think everybody's in one sense, everybody's always seeking more paid work because, if you paid them $1 million to spend an hour of their time, doing something fun, then they would love that, right? So you have to have this kind of definition, like some kind of legal definition of what counts as a job and what doesn't, what counts as paid and what doesn't, right? Like the job guarantee has a minimum, or it pays $15 an hour in her proposal. So paid work is, something that pays above this minimum amount. And then I guess unemployed people are people who don't have that and who want that. Yeah.
Yeah, I just think this is something where it just seemed like she was missing like her own point here. Maybe I'm misinterpreting, but she's emphasizing that the government pays dollars and people want dollars. But as she's pointed out before, like there are real resource constraints. That's really the constraint. So here she's almost like implying that there are no constraints. She's like, great, we have the thing people want, the dollars, so we can just give it to people, in exchange for work. But of course, there are constraints with resources. So I'm not really sure. The way she phrases it is just a little bit odd here, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an implicit assumption that, oh, we have the resources to be able to do this, to be able to pay everyone at least $15 an hour. But then the arguments that she uses, the language that she uses implies that, oh, we can just do it because we can pay it because we have the money, that kind of thing, or because we can spend as much money as we want.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, the real question is like, it's not can we spend up to our resources, or it's maybe instead of asking can we afford to give everyone a $15 an hour job, a question we could ask is what's the maximum we could afford to give people, and if it's above $15, then maybe you want to do that, and if it's below $15, then $15 isn't possible, or you'll see a period of inflation until the $15 isn't $15 worth of purchasing power anymore, or something like that. But this is kind of like you could ask the same questions with basic income, right? Like what level of basic income is optimal for the economy? The difference with basic income is that you're not employing people. You're not creating jobs for the purpose of giving people money or whatever psychological boost you think employment gives workers, that kind of thing. And then the other part, of course, is where she says the U.S. dollar is basically a tax credit. So this is the idea that the taxes drive the currency again. That the government is spending these tax credits into the economy because they've levied a tax, and they want to use that to get people to do the work to earn the tax credits. So then you get the labor, and that's what that's the whole point of the tax, is to drive the labor and to give value to the money, so you can drive the labor with it. And then,
Oh, go ahead. Sorry. This is just when I was referencing before that she kind of like throws this story in. This is, I think, part of where she was doing that. And it just kind of seemed unnecessary because she could have completely skipped the tax credit thing and the fact that like you need taxes, or you need to pay taxes, and just talked about how people need money.
Yeah. I think she could have skipped that here, especially if you care, if you're talking about a job guarantee, then there's a little bit of a contradiction. Like, why did you tax people so much that you need to come around on the other side and guarantee them jobs? Why didn't you just tax them less, and then they're not as unemployed as they otherwise would have been?
Right. It doesn't really make sense.
Yeah. And that's kind of the perspective that I have with basic income, is that you are, by doing the basic income, you're lowering the tax and you're lowering the incentive to work, and you only really want people to need to go out to earn money to the extent that you really want the product of their labor. And if you're guaranteeing people jobs, that means you've kind of over incentivized labor.
Yeah, I want to point out Austin is bringing up like zombie companies and so on in the chat. And one thing we haven't talked too much about is that she's, and maybe you're going to get to it, but since we're low on time, she's very glib in this book, at least, about the potential that the jobs will not be efficient, like that they won't efficiently use people's time. And so that there will be inefficiencies created by something like a jobs guarantee. So she, first of all, she assumes that people are completely idle when they're not in the job. So that's one point we've already talked about. But then like the other point is she's like, oh, you might be worried that they won't be like useful or something. Don't worry. Like MMT says they should be useful. Like that's kind of like her answer to that. It's like, yeah, well, like, of course you're going to want them to be useful. And then she describes this whole process, like that sounds pretty elaborate and like easy to mess up. To me, I don't know. So like where you have like these banks full of jobs, presumably in order of priority or something. And then as people come in, you're trying to match them with those jobs, like depending on the skills that they have. Like this is not easy to do, right? And like it's all at the local community level, I guess, which like I think obviously makes it better than the federal government trying to figure it out for every single community. But like still, there's that. Like, so you just imagine this process. It does not seem super efficient, right? So, or like, it seems like it could go wrong in many, many ways. She also talks about people entering and leaving which is kind of a clever thing. And I can see how that's appealing. Like, okay, there's like more need for, like, there's a recession, so more people go in, but like there's also a stickiness I feel like they gloss over. Like you kind of have to build the skills maybe for whatever government job. Like if these are really useful jobs, they'll need some kind of skills, they'll need some kind of training sometimes. Like, so you build those skills, you're not actually going to go right back out into the private sector and so on. So like there's going to be inefficiencies there. Yeah. And then the third point, obviously, is like anytime you're creating work for a reason other than getting the work done, there's going to be inefficiencies. Like it's kind of hard to get around it. That's kind of like your macro point. But I just wanted to rant about that a little bit because she literally just has like a line about how like MMT says they should be useful. And then she kind of like describes this really complicated, I think easy to screw up process that, and I'm not even like an anti-government person. I'm not even someone who's maximally skeptical about like government's ability to do things effectively. But if you were more skeptical than me, I could imagine you'd be like, are you crazy? Like this is going to be a nightmare. Have you seen the DMV? You know, whatever. So anyway, that's just my rant about that. But she did not, I don't think she did a good job assuaging people with moderate to even like mild concerns about the efficiency of the jobs guarantee.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's a good segue to the next quote here. Here's how it would work. Instead of leaving millions jobless, the government would establish an open-ended commitment to provide job seekers with access to the currency in exchange for performing public service work. Participation would be purely voluntary. No one is required to work in the program. To ensure that we're not just creating make-work jobs, but good jobs, MMT economists have recommended that these jobs pay a living wage and that the work itself should serve a useful purpose.
Oh, good. They've recommended that it be useful. Very good. Now I'm not worried
well,
anymore.
not only that, I mean, do you see the contradiction here? She's saying we're not creating make-work jobs because it pays a living wage. Ensuring that it pays a living wage, that's part of the make work thing, right? Like you're doing it for the benefit of the worker instead of for the product of the labor.
It doesn't even make sense. I mean, that at best that's irrelevant. Like the wage is not the point when it comes to it being concerned that it's make work.
Right.
I don't even know why that's in that sentence. Like you might want to say that it pays a living wage, but it has nothing to do with the concern of make work.
Exactly. That's right. And I would say that the higher you guarantee the wage, the more make work it is, right? It's make wage, right? Maybe not make work, but it's make wage. So yeah, I think that's definitely problematic. And I think, but I do think there's an argument to be made for, keeping people employed, keeping people practicing their skills in case you need to activate them later, that kind of thing. You might want to have kind of a reserve of people who are ready to be activated, and you might want to put resources into kind of like keeping them up to speed. But where you start to run into problems is if you're doing it for the benefit of the worker, right? Yeah. That's not the point. The point is, well, how do we optimize our economy's output?
Totally.
Yeah.
And the dangerous thing here is this, like, of course, like, okay, so you're not going to have people like digging holes and filling them back in again. Like they're going to do things that appear to serve a useful purpose, but that's different from wastefulness in aggregate. And you've talked about this a lot. Like, it's not always that it's not always clear kind of which jobs are needed. And not only that, it might not be that a whole of an entire job is useless, but rather that like the economy is less efficient in its use of labor than it could be. So people's jobs are less useful than they could be. And that could be things like we didn't have enough incentive to automate. So automation is not happening, right? And so like, yeah, your job is needed because we never automated the thing that we never promoted that technology of like self-driving cars or whatever. So yeah, we need you to drive, but only because we didn't have incentives to automate. So there's that. Or there's other kinds of concerns, like there's kind of just this subtle incentive to like use up people's time. And so like we just have things be less efficient in ways we're not even consciously aware of, like all across the economy, right? And that's what's going to happen. And so the dangerous thing, as I said, is that no one's going to see it. Like it's not going to be in your face. It's not going to be obvious. And probably some portion of the jobs will either be useful or be useful given some higher level constraint, like lack of automation or the whole company shouldn't exist or whatever. But like, you won't know that people, maybe you will, but like you might not, right? You might not know that people are wasting their time. It might be more like 50% of everybody's job is useful, or not really, but you know what I mean? And like, it's not really easy to see that it's less efficient than it should be. And so I feel like that's really important, and it's completely missed here with this glib response that like, clearly they're not thinking deeply about it if this is the answer here. That's how I take this, because there's a lot to think about in terms of whether this is going to be acting against efficiency in the labor market. And if they cared about people's opportunity cost of time, they would take this more seriously. But since they think people's opportunity cost of time is essentially negative, actually, like they think people are better off with this job as opposed to not having this to do, then they don't care. They don't seem to care about it, and like they don't seem to think about it. They think a little bit about the details of implementation, which she gets into with like the communities and stuff, but they don't really worry about it in the big picture. And I think that's a huge problem.
Yeah. And it's not just would the people be better off if they weren't working these jobs? It's also, would they be more productive if they weren't working these jobs as well? And when you go out and look at what someone's doing, you can't really know how productive that time is being spent unless you know how they would have been spending their time. So there's that you just can't see it by looking at it because you don't know what the counterfactual is, and then you can't see it based on looking at it also because of what you said, because it's this systemic thing. If you're using economic policy to boost employment, to boost wages, then you're not using the labor market for the purpose of allocating labor efficiently. You're just not. It's impossible to do it that way, no matter how much you want to pay lip service to saying, oh, we're just matching workers who need jobs with work that needs doing or something like that. You know, if someone's being forced to, it's only worth it to force someone to work if you have some idea of the result of that being better than the counterfactual. He says participation would be purely voluntary. Well, it's not voluntary if you are creating economic conditions that force people to need to go out and earn that money.
I mean,
right?
You can starve on the street if you want. Like,
Yeah,
I mean, it is voluntary.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's not a voluntary program. In order for a job guarantee to even make sense at all, you have to have these conditions where you know, you are able to, you've withheld money from people and you're able to give it to them in exchange for labor or something like that.
I just want to point out Austin is talking about these points as well. He mentions that like a lot of resource use and jobs end up getting created around the jobs, like things to support the jobs and so on. And I completely agree with that. And in fact, like this jobs guarantee program is going to create like a ton of jobs because it's going to be super complicated and inefficient to like create all these jobs and think about them and all this stuff, right? So that's just an example. And he says the inefficiency of our current system is invisible, and I totally agree. And I think it's going to be kind of like more of these kinds of invisible inefficiencies that would just be amplified by something like a jobs guarantee. As an aside, I want to say that like compared to the status quo, as opposed to compared to a basic income, I suspect people's quality of life would be drastically better for the most part, like many people. So like I don't, you know, I'm very unhappy with it because I compare it to a basic income, but like I see the reason that people, if you're not thinking of basic income is a good idea, like why this seems appealing for sure, because you're giving all these people an income and like with better conditions probably than the work, you know, probably fewer hours working and better benefits and like more healthcare and stuff like that than they're currently getting. So like certainly it would be really massive for a lot of people. So I don't mean to just like poo-poo on it, but like compared to a basic income, I have all these concerns.
Yes, having a job guarantee is certainly better than kind of the status quo that we have now. Just like having a minimum wage, like I wouldn't press a big red button that just eliminated the minimum wage. But I think minimum wage is a terrible idea, and it's only, you know, useful because we don't have a basic income. And I think the same thing is true of a job guarantee. Like
right now, we're withholding money from people and forcing people to work to survive, and they can't necessarily get a job. So it's like really, really bad. Yeah. But and also when I say compared to basic income, I should say I also kind of have in my mind as an ideal probably national healthcare of some kind too, because here she's tying, like we often do, she's tying like the jobs to healthcare, or like she's assuming people would get healthcare, which is another factor as well. Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next one here. If the economy slips into a recession, more people will transition into public service employment. This is under a job guarantee, and the budget will automatically register higher spending to support those jobs. When the economy improves and the private sector is ready to begin hiring again, workers will move out of the program and the budget will automatically shrink. This makes the job guarantee a powerful new automatic stabilizer, one that would fortify the existing driverless mechanisms in the federal budget. So this is something that MMT people love to talk about, the automatic stabilizer quality of the job guarantee, that it pushes against the business cycle. And it's kind of tragic that they feel so excited about this feature of the job guarantee, because if you think about what's causing the business cycle in the first place, it's the fact that we are overly stimulating the financial sector, which is causing instability. And we're doing it for the purpose of propping up consumer spending, of propping up consumer incomes. If you have a basic income, there's nothing to automatically stabilize anymore. You're not going to have these volatile financial conditions of the boom and bust cycle, that kind of thing. Maybe you'll have a recession in the form of, your real resources take a hit and your economy is producing less, that kind of thing. But a job guarantee isn't going to help there either, because it's not a problem of just kind of pushing back against financial conditions. There's actually less stuff for people to buy. So the basic income, you might have a lower basic income either nominally or in real purchasing power because there's less stuff to buy. But the basic income is going to be able to activate whatever the economy is capable of providing for people.
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore, like, this is very clever. Like, I can see why this is exciting. And she builds to it really nicely in the chapter, because she starts to talk about other programs that serve this feature, right? Like not Social Security, but unemployment and like SNAP and other programs that kind of kick in more when there's a recession and kind of fuel more money into the economy and so on. And so then she kind of like builds that in, and then you're getting used to that idea. And then she has this idea, and it seems like a much, much better version of that. And so like, it makes sense. But as you point, I think, as you said, it kind of takes for granted the boom bust cycle as something that's just going to happen, as opposed to thinking about ways that we could reduce that cycle. And I think that's obviously because there just seems to be no emphasis, as we said before, on how the interest rates control the boom bust cycle by constraining or expanding private credit. So you just sort of missed that whole point.
Yeah, she talks about it as a natural feature of capitalism, right? But it's really a problem of using the financial sector to provide the economy its money, using that and having it kind of push out through jobs and wages in the private sector. With a basic income, if you're giving people their money directly, you don't have to do any of that. You can rein in the financial sector and stabilize things. So here, let's get into the final quote, which I think you'll appreciate, Bethany. It's an opportunity to transform tens of billions of hours of human idleness into a wide array of jobs that will help us build an economy that is both more resilient and more environmentally and ecologically sustainable. So, the hope, the goal, the dream for humanity is to maximize the idleness, is to maximize the extent to which we don't have to pull people away from what they would otherwise be doing. So the idea that you would view that as a problem and want to pull people into jobs just to kind of end the idleness, it kind of goes against, maximum prosperity for the people.
Yeah. I mean, I think freedom would be another word for idleness here. And then that would really change the way that you think about it, and maybe appropriately set up some of the trade-offs. Like, okay, we take away some of people's freedom because we need to like deal with climate change or do all these things. But yeah, it's just so disrespectful of people's like how people spend their time. I don't understand. Like, what about people spending time with their kids? I mentioned that one, but also people spending time with their loved ones, like their friends, their family, their other family members, even just relaxing or exercising or meditating or watching TV or whatever. People are doing things that they want to do, and you're pulling them away from that. And not only, and there are two components to that. It affects their individual well-being, which is ultimately what we care about in aggregate. And a lot of those things that people are doing happen to be good for other people too. So all of that is being taken away from. So I really just bristle quite a bit at the disrespect for how people naturally spend their time, which seems like incredibly kind of odd and paternalistic. And I'm assuming is, like I said, coming from the angle of like this research and this perspective on people who lose jobs in our current economy being unhappy about that, as opposed to really thinking about what it would be like to have something like a basic income world where you really could use your time the way that you want to. I mean, maybe pointing her out to the idea of retirement, which she's really into. Like, she wants people to be able to retire, and suddenly then their idleness is valuable. Like, so it doesn't even really make sense, right? Like, you arguably have more energy to do more things when you're younger, like with your time. But like when you retire, then you should be able to enjoy life. And then like your idleness is somehow good, but like earlier it's just a bane on your existence. Like that doesn't even add up. So I don't know what she would say to that contrast, but clearly she's not quite like thinking clearly about her time, I think. I don't know what she would say if I got to talk to her. But
well, I think there's an intuition that people need to kind of put in their time and contribute their fair share during the prime of their life, and then they can, reap their rewards in retirement, that kind of thing.
No, I get that, but she other times doesn't even frame like not having having a job as a sacrifice in that way. She kind of frames it as like a benefit to the individual as well, right? Like you're getting to have this job, hooray, and like it's useful for the rest of us. It's like.
I think a useful question to ask if you're an MMTer is, why is there such a thing as a job in the first place? And the answer is that there are some things that people don't want to do, and you have to pay them to do it. That's why there's such a thing as a job. And if we weren't in a situation where people weren't naturally doing the things that needed to be done in society, then why would you need jobs?
And in fact, their own theory has this whole thing about how you have to impose taxes to get people to do work. So it's not really such a favor to them in those cases.
Right. If you have to impose taxes to get people to do work, then obviously they didn't want to do it to begin with, right?
Right. Yeah. So I think it's, as it happens with all of us, like it's just a little bit inconsistent, like kind of depending on the rhetorical point that she wants to make. But overall, she writes a powerful book. Obviously, I disagree with some of the things, but I also think she makes a really beautiful case, like a really impressive, at least, case for like some aspects of things that I agree with that many people don't, like how to think about resources as a constraint rather than dollars. So.
Yeah, and the deficit thing, it is holding us back, and that's important. Like the main thesis of the book is correct. It's just that a lot of this supporting stuff is a little bit off, and maybe a lot of the kind of related things that MMT talks about maybe don't quite add up. But yeah, this is important. The idea that you should be primarily focused on balancing tax revenues with outlays and not running a deficit, that's problematic, and we could be doing a lot better. We could be building a better economy for the people, right? She would have a job guarantee. It'd be an important ingredient of that. I would not. I would have a basic income for getting people their money, and then there's obviously lots of other important things that the government needs to do for the people as well. So that's the book. We're done. We made it through. We had 9 sessions of this, the introduction and all 8 chapters. Thanks for sticking through it, you guys. Next week, the topic is likely to be basic income and financial instability, but it might change and be a surprise topic instead.
Very interesting. So is that it's so interesting that that's the topic, considering that you might have.
Considering that I'm going to be writing a paper and giving a talk on that subject. Yes. So yeah. All right. Thanks, guys. Good.